Our next speaker is Andy Krueger. He's a UX designer at Merrill Corporation. One of his lifelong interests and passions is games, both physical and digital, as well as game design. He's an event manager, so I would love your feedback about this later. But he has turned UX designer, and he enjoys bridging the gap between live events and the digital experience. His speech is called Designing for Addiction, Examining the Free-to-Play Game Genre. Put your hands together for Andy Krueger.
Hey, good morning. How's everyone doing so far? It's almost lunchtime. We're going to get there together. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. I am Andy Krueger. I'm a user experience designer, and today we'll be talking about the design of social, free-to-play, mobile, primarily, games. So let's see. I'm trying to click through this. I think I need to do that first. No? Let's click there. I did it. All right. So I'm just going to start with this quote here, which is from a former employee of a free-to-play game company. And they make this statement that although they used to work at this company designing these games and they did very well and they made money, they came to the conclusion that these games are designed for addiction. And I want to kind of take that as a starting point, and over the next half hour or so, just tease that statement apart, really take a look into what's involved with the design of these games, why they're made the way they are, and get to that ethical question at the end. We're all here today to talk about that good versus evil design question, so we'll get into that. But first, before we dive into that big question of addiction and good versus evil, I'll just be giving an introduction of the digital game industry and kind of understand the background of how all of this got started, and then discuss some of the common game mechanics that go into these games and are shared by a lot of these games, and then explain the psychology behind these design choices. And I will try to keep this relatively short and leave some time at the end for Q&A. So first of all, what are free-to-play games, or FTP games as they're called, and I'll be abbreviating on the slides for the rest of the talk. So these are also known as freemium, or in the Nintendo game store they call this free to start, which is maybe more of an apt title. And you know, that's the obvious thing about these games, is that there's no cost to download them. So you can go on your phone or your console, your PC, and there's a price of $0, so there's no cost to get started. And they're going to be earning all of their revenue through either in-app purchases or IAPs, and through advertising. And so you can contrast this with the traditional model of game design, which is sometimes now called pay-to-play in contrast, or P2P, where you would buy a game up front for whatever price, and then now you own it, and you've got everything in it, and you can just play it however you like. So for free-to-play game design, there are a few different models. One is a game demo, which is kind of like the old shareware model, where you get a little bit of the game for free, you can try it, and if you like it, you pay one time and you unlock the rest of it. Another is episodic, where there are games that you get the first, essentially, episode of a longer story for free. If you like that, you can buy subsequent episodes and continue through until the end. And then there's expansion, which is mostly something you see with digital card games or board games, where you get a sort of base game experience for free. And again, if you like that, you can buy expansions, and they might have different themes or pieces or rule sets or whatever. But the most common and really most profitable model, what we see the most of, is what's called this social free-to-play game genre. And so these games typically are going to require you to be online, either all of the time to play it at all, or most of the time to kind of connect and update. They're going to involve some kind of human interaction with other people that are playing the game, and they generally don't have a traditional story arc structure or a real ending. They're just going to kind of continue forever in a persistent state that you can keep playing forever and ever, which is sort of a key thing that we'll keep coming back to. And so these social free-to-play games are what I'll be talking about for the rest of my presentation. So this list is the world's most profitable video games from a couple of months ago in the three major platform categories: console, PC, and mobile. And I highlighted the free-to-play games here to kind of demonstrate how this is taking over in the industry. So you can see it's 7 on the PC, and it's only 1 on console, but it is the world's most profitable game on console. And every single mobile game is free-to-play. And so the other thing to note about this is that if you were to design for addiction, there'd be no better way to do that than on a device that you carry with you at all times. And so the games I'm going to be talking about also as examples are going to be this #1 game, Honor of Kings, and Candy Crush Saga. I'll give some specific examples on how these games get people engaged. So one of the key metrics for free-to-play games is player retention, because again, you're not paying anything to start playing these games, so you don't really have any investment in them. So if you paid $60 for a premium AAA game on the console, you're probably going to give it a shot, play it for a few hours, see if you like it or not, before you give up on it. But if you didn't pay anything, there's no reason to keep playing it unless you're hooked right away. And so you can kind of see that in the numbers. Within the first day, about 60% of people that download a free app have already stopped playing. They're never going to come back. And by the end of the month, if you're lucky, you'll have 10% of people still active in playing your free-to-play game. I talked to a local game developer in town here who said, actually for his studio, even 5% would be considered really good for a successful game of people still playing and engaged. And that's just the players. So when you look at the people that are paying to play the game, this is an even smaller percent. It's 2 to 4% of that 10% who still play are going to spend any money on your game ever. And it's another 10% of that 2%, about 0.19% is the figure that I've seen, that are going to be what are known as the whales of the game, and they're going to contribute more than 50% of the revenue of the game, which is kind of astounding. It's this tiny little fraction. I tried to kind of outline it there. You can maybe barely see that little black dot that's meant to represent these whales. It's just this tiny, tiny bit of the overall number of people that download one of these free-to-play game apps. And so there are a couple of key takeaways from this, and one is that at the end of the sales funnel is super, super tiny, and the other is that there's a design consideration here, which is that we have two very different user groups. And so on the one hand, you've got this relatively large number of free players, represented here by this goldfish, and then on the other, you've got a small group of players represented by this whale, and an even tinier amount that are going to contribute this huge amount of your total revenue, known as the whales. And the important thing is that free-to-play games really need both of these players. So you might think, well, we need to design for these whales because that's where all our money is coming from. But the truth is that you need both for a few reasons. One is community. With any game, you need a certain amount of hype, you need some press coverage, and you just need people downloading the game also in numbers, because that funnel gets so small. If you're not starting with a large user base, you'll never achieve the amount of players you need to make it profitable and sustainable. The other is content, and this is especially for things like ranked competitive games where you're doing some kind of matchmaking. So if the point of the game is to play with people and they're trying to get you at playing people about your skill level, you can just kind of need a certain number of players to be able to achieve that in a timely manner. And third, of course, is the revenue piece, because all paid players start as free players, and so eventually you're working towards that conversion. And I mentioned that ad revenue is a part of this as well, so some of these free players may be contributing revenue in that way, but again, 50% of the revenue is coming from these whales. And so the important thing to know about this conversion process is that most long-term players do end up spending money on the game. So you can see here that after about a year and a half, players that are still engaged in playing, about 2/3 of them now are spending money on the game. And this is, of course, way higher than that overall percentage of that 2 to 4% of players that might end up paying something overall on average. And so if games are able to keep these players active and engaged, they've got a way better chance at eventually making some money from them and converting them. And you can note that even after this much time, about 1/3 of these, and this graph is really leveling out, about 1/3 of them are still free players. That's still an important portion of your player base that need to be kept in mind. And so this need for this long-term engagement, or addiction, or whatever you might want to call it, end up calling it at the end, and I'll save that for the end, but that need for that long-term play model is going to tie into all the game design decisions that go into these games. And so I'm going to start by sharing some examples from this game, which was, remember, the most profitable mobile game in the world. And you can see here, specifically, in China is where this game was created. It's called Honor of Kings, I guess is the rough translation there. And I want to note, again, I'm using this game as an example because it's the #1 game in the world, but I'm not picking on this game because it's especially bad. The point here is that the things that they do, the mechanics that they use, are pretty common across all of these games. And so this one, when it came to the United States, was rebranded as Arena of Valor, and so the screenshots I'll be sharing are from this US version of the game. I just put some sales figures in there. You can see this game, this one single game cleared almost $2 billion last year. That's over $5 million a day on average. And that was in 2017. It's 2018, getting towards the end. They're still the #1 game. So, you know, that's pretty good numbers. And by the way, this one publisher also had 4 or 5 of the top 10 mobile games in that top 10 chart. So they're doing okay for themselves. And so I just want to show you how some of the real mechanics that this game is using to get that long-term engagement. And starting with this, which might be the first screen that you see when you log into the game, it's this daily login screen. So, you know, now that I've presented this idea that long-term engagement is important, you can probably understand why something like this would help. You're encouraging people to log in day after day, but the question is, what's that underlying psychological principle that makes this so effective? And so to understand this, I'm going to spend just a bit of time talking about these psychological experiments done back in the early part of the last century by a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. And he did these experiments mostly with rats and pigeons in these boxes. They're known as operant conditioning boxes, or later known as Skinner boxes, because that was his name. And this research that he did really highlights some fundamental principles that apply to game design, and not just digital game design, but also board games and card games and a lot of other things as well. And at the most basic level, what he was doing was experimenting on influencing behavior by giving a reward or removing a negative stimulus in exchange for the animal performing some behavior. And so at the very basic level for this, the rat in the box would be placed in there, and it would run around, and sooner or later it's going to just bump into this lever. And when it bumps into the lever, some little food pellet comes out. And so it's now learned eventually to associate this behavior, pressing the lever, with this reward of getting the food. And then we move on to something called fixed ratio reinforcement. So there's a few different reward schedules, they're called, that I'm going to introduce here and see how they play into this game design. And so for this, there'll be a certain number of presses now that associate with the food. So for this series of experiments, you know, rat presses the button once, oh, nothing happens. Presses it twice, nothing happens. Presses it 3 times, gets the food. And every time it presses the button 3 times, it gets the food. And the interesting thing about this is that now by actually giving the rat more work to do, it became more engaged. It was quicker to press the button, and it's quicker to start pressing the button again after getting its food. And so these previous 2 examples involved a ratio, or a number of actions. This idea of fixed interval reinforcement, of course, refers to periods of time. And so in these experiments, there would be a signal used to tell the rat when it could get the food. And of course, this is really important too if you're trying to control behavior, because now we're not just teaching a rat to associate a behavior with a reward, but we're telling it when to do what we want it to do, which is very powerful. And this is also really closely related to how we form habits. There's something called the habit cycle that I'm going to refer back to a few times. And so first is the cue, which in this case for the rat is this light turning on, or there might be a sound played over the speaker. And then is a routine, which should be, again, pressing the lever. And when the rat performs the routine, it receives this reward of the food pellet coming in, or the negative stimulus, like that electrical shock being removed from the floor. That is a reward for it, and that's going to just reinforce the cycle for the next time. And so the way that this is used in games is these fixed interval rewards, this daily or it might be a certain number of hours that you log in and get a reward, really ties back into this type of motivation. There's the cue, which is maybe an app notification that you get, or maybe just daily you start to actually feel this urge, like, oh, it's time for me to log in. And then you do your routine, you sign in the reward, and then you get this treasure or whatever. And this kind of behavior is really great for habituation because it keeps players engaged and active over the long term. Something interesting, though, is that this reward schedule is only effective if the rewards continue, because you've learned to associate a certain number of actions or a certain amount of time with getting a reward. If that reward's removed, the rat pretty quickly stops. It figures, no reward's coming, it's no longer consistent, I'm not going to keep doing this behavior. And so one clever thing that this app does is it gives these retro sign-ins for daily logins. So even if you miss a day, they've given you this great, really gift of being able to go back and plug in those missed days so you can continue logging in without missing anything. So if you'd missed those days and missed out on your rewards, well, maybe you'd figure, yeah, I missed it, I'll go do something else. But now you never need to stop. Isn't that great? And so that's really helpful at getting that habituation started. And then we have something called variable ratio reinforcement, which is now not quite random number of button presses, but a number of button presses with odds. So for example, 1 in 10 button presses gets you a reward. And so now what the rat is learning is that, I press the button a few times and maybe I get the food quickly, or maybe I have to press it a bunch of times before I get the food, but sooner or later I'm gonna get that food and I'm gonna keep pressing that button. And with this reward schedule, really proved to be the most effective at influencing behavior. These rats were the fastest to press that lever and to just keep pressing that lever even after they'd gotten the food. And so the parallels, I think, to gambling here are pretty obvious. Slot machines, for example, work on this principle, the eventual payout after a few tries. And some non-game examples here, maybe checking your Twitter feed or looking at your email. Most of it's junk or not really interesting, but every once in a while it's worth it. You find that really funny tweet that you want to share with people or that really controversial thing. It keeps us coming back. And this type of schedule is a lot slower to extinguish as well, because if that reward's removed, it takes us a lot longer to realize it, because now the longer we go without a reward, the more imminent it feels, because we know that eventually we're going to hit that jackpot. And so you see this mechanic in a lot of games of the prize wheel or the loot box that you open up and you get a supposedly random reward. Nothing is random, by the way, in these games. They're employing economists and psychologists and data analysts full-time to make sure that they're playing to your individual preferences and patterns as a person. But they're presented as being a random thing, and of course some of these rewards aren't so great and some are really great. And so there's a motivation to go for the thing that you want. And recently this type of random draw actually became governed in China as a form of gambling. So if games are charging for this kind of thing, they have to post clear odds of winning each of the rewards on this wheel. Obviously, one difference maybe here between the US and the Chinese app. So for rats, being motivated by food, there's a problem with this type of motivation, and that's the concept of satiation. After eating enough food, our brains, if they're working as an average brain does, are going to send a signal that say, hey, you're full, it's time to stop eating. And there's a natural stopping point that we get. But modern first world humans aren't usually working on a subsistence basis, and so we're actually more like the rats in a different series of experiments done by Olds and Milner, where they connected these electrodes directly to the reward center in a rat's brain. And so in these experiments, the rat presses the lever, and instead of getting food, it gets electrical shock applied directly to its brain that it experiences as pleasure. The first time they did this, it was actually an accident. They were testing something else, but in one of the rats, they bent the wire, and it went into what became known as this reward center of the brain. And this rat just kept pressing the lever over and over and over again until it died. And it led to this discovery of the reward center and some really interesting psychological breakthroughs. Not great for that rat, and not great for gamers either. I mean, and I don't want to make light of this, because in some extreme rare cases, there have been reported that gamers have died because they've been so involved in the game that they're doing and didn't want to leave that they hadn't eaten or slept or taken care of their other needs. And the truth is that this isn't just bad for us. The game makers don't want that either. Now, and that's an extreme case, right? But more common is you just kind of burn out, you play too much, and you're just kind of tired of the experience and you step away. And they don't want that. They need us to stay engaged for long periods of time in order to get the conversion that they need. And so one way that they do this, I'm going to talk about a different way when I get to Candy Crush in a bit, is with diminishing returns. And so you remember the daily login reward? You log in and you get treasure, and that's the easiest thing in the world, right? All you've done is tap the app and boom, you've got something great. And then they do something special for new players, because that new player retention is so important, where they give you a really great reward in this game, a hero, which is something that costs a good amount of real world money if you were to buy it, just for logging in and playing a few matches, which you can do in under a half an hour. And that's awesome. And then after that, you can keep playing, and every match you play, you get a few little rewards, but now it's not as great. And so as long as you're having fun, you can keep playing, but there's not as much motivation, especially when you know that tomorrow you can log in and get those really great rewards all over again. So there's not as much incentive to keep playing over and over and over again in a short period of time. There is incentive to keep coming back and collecting these daily rewards. And now we are humans. We don't like to think that we're as simple as rats. We kind of like to think we're a little more sophisticated than that, even though all that stuff that came before really works. We're also social creatures, and we like to tell ourselves stories about what we're doing. If we don't feel like our actions have some meaning in our lives, we will usually stop doing them. And so there are a bunch of different theories about motivation and how that works. I'm going to share this one proposed in the 70s called need theory. And this ties together really well to game design, I think. And essentially what he did is outline 3 basic drives that are shared with all humans, but in different degrees. And so I'm going to introduce all 3 of these, and I'd encourage you, too, to kind of think about how strong each of these drives is for you. So the first is power, which is the drive to dominate others. And this is a competitive game. And so you can see here, in this case, actually, my team was dominated. We lost 0-10. Just weren't able to pull it off that time. But you know, just as a win feels really good, a loss can also be really motivating if you have this drive. The next is achievement, the drive to improve on a task. And so I highlighted my little hero there in the lower left to show that I was the MVP in this game. So even though my team lost, I was still able to achieve something on a personal level. And of course, the game also keeps track of all these kinds of stats of your win-loss ratio with different heroes and stuff over time, so you can see how you're doing in the long term about improving in the game. And the third is the need for affiliation. This is the drive to build and maintain close and harmonious relationships. And so after this very match, I got invited by my teammate, Catman666, to join another match. And I want to help my teammate out, and I also want to get some more rewards for playing, and so I want to click accept. And actually, this is a pretty strong drive in me, which was really reinforced by the fact that even though I knew I wanted to get a picture of this screen the first few times it popped up, I hit accept right away. Until finally I paused and I caught this one. But this can be a really powerful motivator. And these are also really called out in the advertising for the game itself. And again, if you thought about kind of which of these is strongest for you, think about if any of these messages resonate with you, because the way they present this game, I think, is pretty clear. Power, 5 versus 5 real-time battle, you dominate your enemies. You've got achievement, master your hero. You pick this person that you play as, and you get better and better. And then affiliation. Oh, it's esports for everyone. It's not just for hardcore players. This is open and inviting, and it's collaborative. You're working with your team. And so this social piece comes into play and is super important as well. And speaking of social, let's move on now to Candy Crush Saga. Has anyone heard of this game? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, great. So this game might look really different on the surface from Arena of Valor, right? That game was kind of dark and serious, competitive. And this game is bright and colors and happy, and it's a single-player puzzle game, right? But I'm going to point out just a couple of differences, but the main point, again, is that they share so many similarities, which defines these kind of free-to-play social games as a genre, I think, outside of the whatever might happen to be the core gameplay element. So first, just a quick review here. Here's our daily login screen again. So we have this fixed interval reinforcement, establishing this habit of play, coming back day after day and getting some gifts. The one on day 7 is bigger. Does that mean it's better? I don't know. You got to log in to find out, right? And then the variable ratio reinforcement. So this is something now that when you log in, every 24 hours, you play this beanstalk game, and you're going to pick one of these flowers, and it poofs open, and there's hopefully some good candy reward in there. And if you get that, it's going to be added to your total on the bottom. And you can quit and collect your rewards, or you can keep going. But if you hit the wrong one, then everything is lost. And so you're gambling a little bit with this. And remember, this reward schedule is the most effective at motivating behavior. So in both of these games, I actually found several examples of all of these, but for the sake of time, here's one. And now with Candy Crush and a lot of other games, they use something called an energy system. So I kind of compared this to the diminishing rewards in Arena of Valor. For Candy Crush, if you play the actual game, the match 3 game where you're matching candies and they poof and disappear, and you lose a level, then you're going to lose one of these lives, and that's that 0 in the pink heart. And so if you lose too much, you lose all your lives, you can't play the game anymore. And when these games first started being made and I started playing them, this baffled me. I didn't understand. Why don't you want me to play your game? I want to keep playing, but if you've been paying attention, you should be able to probably think of a few reasons why this would work, right? And the first is a pretty surface layer, obvious, there's monetization. So you can use your real world money and do an in-app purchase of their gold bars and buy more energy, and then you can keep playing. And this is very effective. I saw a quote somewhere from King, the publishers of Candy Crush, where they said they make over 50% of their in-app revenue purchases from this type of energy purchase. And the next, of course, is habituation, right? Because if they don't want you to keep playing forever and ever and burn out. They want you to stop and take a break and come back. So they're perfectly happy for you to close out of the app and stop playing for a while. And of course, when all your lives are replenished, they're perfectly happy again to send you that helpful cue and let you know it's time to come back in and play some more and do your behavior and get your reward and continue to establish this habit cycle. And last of all, of course, is the social element, because you're going to be prompted to connect this to Facebook, because why wouldn't you connect it to Facebook and get all your friends on there? And then you can send them a request for lives. And what does this do? Well, now you're doing King's job for them. Now you're the one sending the cue to your friend. And it's not just coming from Candy Crush, it's coming from you, someone that they love and trust to be thinking in their best interest. And now this might be the thing that gets them back into the game. So you can see it's a really powerful metric. And speaking of social, it's going back to the 3 drives here of need theory. So Candy Crush addresses these in a slightly different way. One is this leaderboard. So this is a pretty common thing, high scores and things. You can beat your friends, of course, too. That's a powerful thing, that social drive. Some people that you're probably more engaged than just random strangers. And I wouldn't say that I usually care about this kind of thing in games, but something about the way they animate your name, kind of scrolling to the top of the list and going, oh, it's slowing down, am I going to make it? And then it gets to the top, and I still feel pretty good when it hits the top, especially when my score is that great. Look at that. Take that, Jen and Andy. And then we have achievement. So, apart from you might go back and play a level and get those high scores, or the game's going to give you a little quest to do. But there's also this long-term goal of just playing through the game board and doing each of these levels in turn and progressing through Candy Crush itself as this meta goal for achievement. And this need for affiliation, of course, I mentioned requesting and sending lives to your friends. That's one way to engage socially in the game. But even if you have no friends, and this is before I connected to Facebook, so I'm just this dog over here, they'll just match you up to a random stranger. And even this is effective, because we as humans still have this kind of instinctual need to help each other out, especially if this drive is really strong in you. And so, I don't know Graham. I don't know who this guy is, but I still don't want to let him down. It gives you this behavior to do in the game, and if you both do it, then you get a shared reward. And who am I to deny Graham this great reward, whatever it was, I don't remember. And so now I'm ready to pick back up this question of addiction. Because this is really key. I think you need a working definition of what addiction is. And I am not a psychologist. I'm a UX designer, so I use psychology in my work. I just hit the mic, sorry. But I wanted to make sure I read up on this and really understood the best that I could how we understand addiction. And one of the things I learned is that our understanding on this is changing over time. It's still kind of changing and evolving as we learn more. But I saved it for this point in the talk also because I found that there are a lot of talks and a ton of articles online where people kind of present some of these game mechanics that I said presented before and just kind of make this blanket statement, kind of beg the question of, oh, these games, look at that. They're so addictive. Isn't that bad? Okay, end of article. And it's important to really evaluate that statement and that claim. And so I want to go with this definition. I'm just going to read this out. That behavioral addictions arise when a person can't resist a behavior which, despite addressing a deep psychological need in the short term, produces significant harm in the long term. And there's one thing I want to pull out of this before we even move on, which is often missed, I think, in a lot of the more alarmist stuff that I read about, especially game addiction or digital addiction, which is that addictions do fulfill a need. There's a good side to them. There really is something that they're doing. It's bad in the long term, yes, but in the short term, it's really fulfilling an important purpose in someone's life. And the important takeaway from that, I think, is even though we have a much better understanding of how addiction works now, there's still kind of a tendency when you see or hear that someone is addicted to something to think that they're just kind of susceptible to that genetically, or they're kind of weak-willed, or they're just maybe not very bright. And the truth is that really anyone can be addicted to anything if they have this need and it's not being fulfilled elsewhere. And so I've been talking a lot about habituation through the talk, and that's because the habits and addictions are really closely related. There's a fine line between the two. And let me just say straight out, there's no question in my mind that these games are designed for habituation, right? They have to be. They need people to keep playing over and over and over again for a long period of time to make the money to make them profitable. But just as there are good and bad habits, you use the exact same mechanics to create a good habit as a bad one. We kind of talked about things like fitness trackers, and I, without knowing what previous speakers were going to talk about, use this as an example too. So even a good habit can turn into an addiction. And I've got this hypothetical jogger here. So let's say that this woman went to her doctor. They said, hey, you need to become more physically active. She said, okay. She went out and she downloaded a fitness app that's going to track all her activity. She got a wearable that's going to track her steps and remind her when she needs to get active. And she's developed a healthy exercise habit that's helped her to get more physically fit. But this runner, this totally different one, is obsessed with keeping her streak going because she's got an app that's going to give her a badge after a certain number of days that says, good work, you've never missed a day. And so even though she's gotten injured or sick and it's hurt her long-term health and some of her relationships, she's continued to run and hurt herself in the long term. So what's the problem here? These behaviors from the outside can look identical. So what's the difference? Well, a habit is a subconscious pleasure-seeking behavior that can become an addiction if it fulfills that deep psychological need. And these addictions are more difficult to break, and they're also more harmful in the long run, generally. And so I made this caveat, I'm not a psychologist. I'm also not a game developer, I'm just a gamer. I'm very interested in them. I read a lot about game design. I think it's fascinating. I listen to a lot of podcasts about game design. And so I want to focus on the impact on players, and I'll give kind of both sides of the argument here a chance to speak with their own words or in summary here, make their closing arguments. And what a lot of free-to-play game devs say is, for one thing, we've added a social good to the world. We've created more games. We've lowered the barrier to entry. Anyone with a phone or a device can play these games. And not only that, we're expanding the market. Way more people play games now. And this is true because playing video games used to be considered kind of a weird, niche, gross thing to do. The main audience for Candy Crush is middle-aged women, not a core gaming demographic a few years back. And so there's definitely truth to that. I also watched a talk recently by a developer, and at the end, in her Q&A, she was asked straight out by someone in the audience, well, what about things like variable reward reinforcements? Isn't that a little bit kind of difficult to square, when you're charging for these tries at these boxes? And she said, no, that kind of reward, random chance, that's just fun, and because people are paying small amounts over time, it proves they're making rational choices about their spending. And the truth is, whales want to spend this much money. They've chosen this as their leisure activity, and they want to put this much money into it. And a couple of points there. One thing, she was saying her company and others, if they see someone go on the game and start spending lots of money, they will actually call them. And one of the reasons is because they want to make sure it's not credit card fraud, because then it's going to get charged back, and that's not great. And so they'll get to know these whales a little bit. And the bottom line is that there's kind of this feeling, this sense that I get from reading a lot of these things, that the market has spoken. Free-to-play is here. It's kind of taken over. It's where the big money is. And as a company, they're just making a responsible choice by designing a product that's going to be profitable. And so on the other hand, we see some free-to-play game designers and developers, more and more actually over the years, coming out and speaking publicly against some of these mechanics and saying, sometimes straight out, hey, no, these mechanics are driving addictive behaviors. They're not good. I feel bad making this kind of game. This second one is actually a direct quote from a much longer article. It's kind of a confessional written by developers saying, I'm not here to even say that these games are good or bad, but let me tell you what we do to get to know these people and get their money. And it's fascinating. And they go as far as, in one case, he said, we Facebook friend people with a fake account, of course. We get to know them down to the level of designing an in-game item for you to purchase with the colors of your favorite football team on it. And you better believe that works. And that's how they exploit these whales. And so, the bottom line here in a lot of cases just comes from, I feel gross. I don't want to do this. I'm a game designer. I just want to make games. I just want to make delightful experiences for everyone. I didn't get into this for this business stuff. And I think this is really fair too, because for one thing, from top to bottom, these games have to be designed in different ways. If you're a designer of a traditional pay-to-play game, all you have to worry about is the player's entertainment, because they've already paid for it. Now they just can enjoy it. And if they only enjoy it for an hour or 100 hours, it's all the same to you. You've already sold the product. But if you are selling free-to-play games, you have to design for both entertainment and for monetization, because that's how these games work. And in the games industry, game designer and game UX right now are mostly very different titles. But in a lot of web and app design, that is not the case. I'm a UX designer for a web-based software as a service application, and that means that I'm designing for the experience as a whole. I kind of have to bear in mind both of these things, how they impact each other. But sometimes I hear a similar argument from UX, and Molly in the keynote this morning kind of touched on this as well. There's this thought that, well, I'm just a user advocate. I make the fun thing. I make the delightful experience, this delicious chocolate reward over here. And then on the other hand, you've got this peanut butter of business decisions and this profit-driven model. And yuck, I don't want any of that. That's for managers and for the board of directors and all the financial department and everything. And I don't want your profit-driven economic peanut butter in my creative chocolate. That's ruining my flavor. But I want to kind of bring this up to a higher level too, because I think probably most of us are not in the game design industry, but a lot of us are designers. And there is this question of ultimately, what experience is it that you want your users to have? And the other point here is that if you're not making these business decisions as a UX designer, well, someone else is making them for you. And so I would encourage you to really own this, bring the two together, and be that delicious treat that really combines both. I think the best UX designers have to be thinking about both the user needs and the business needs and making sure that they are in alignment. Because just as eating nothing but chocolate is going to rot your teeth over time, user advocacy without considering business needs, that's not really sustainable either. You could design the best, most amazing, beautiful experience or product, but if your company can't afford to make it because they've gone out of business, then that doesn't really help anyone. And in the same way, of course, if you're not thinking about user needs and you're only thinking about business needs, well, that gets you into exploitation and maybe some of the bad stuff that we talked about today. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up there. And again, I hope that there's something in this talk that you can maybe take and apply to your work. In terms of the game industry, first of all, I had an earlier version of this talk that went way deeper into these individual mechanics and kind of cut that short because I thought the psychology stuff was more interesting and important. But get at me later if you want to talk about game stuff. So we just wanted to run through why these games are designed the way they are, give you some context into that, what they do to achieve this habitual play behavior, and then talk about how that works, really that psychological underpinning and the nature of addiction there. And the big question of the day, is this for good or evil? Notice I didn't really answer that. And are they designed for addiction either? I mean, I don't know if they are intentionally designed to get people addicted. Mostly because I'm not in there doing it. Also because I don't know if that's really in users' or companies' best interests. But it's kind of unarguably a consequence of the design, which I think should prompt anyone doing that kind of thing again to ask, well, is this the kind of experience that I want to be involved in or not? And you have to make your own decision and be at peace with that. So I'm just going to leave it there and open up for questions. It's a big room, so shout out if I don't see you. Yes?
For the people who are whales, is there like an average spend there?
Yeah, I found a lot of different metrics on that. I should mention like the charts and the numbers I was sharing kind of came from a bunch of different sources, or what seemed to be the most comprehensive or reliable things that I found. It depends on the game and the platform, how they define that. One of the things I found was something like $50 a month plus would define you as a whale, but it really kind of depends on the type of game and the size of it. So it can vary a lot. I would think for a game like Arena of Valor that's clearing 5 million a day, $50 a day isn't going to really count as one of your top buyers. Yes?
Would the most addicting games also be the most successful games?
See, that's a great question because I don't know. I think the most habituating games would be, right? One of the problems with addiction as a game design goal is that there are negative consequences, and I think if you are clearly addicted to a game and you have friends or loved ones that are seeing you get into this addictive behavior, there's more of a chance they're going to pull you out of it or stop you from spending that money if they have the opportunity. If it seems like you're still having fun, maybe not. So I would say no, personally, which is part of the reason why I say, personally, I don't think these games are intended to addict necessarily. Intended to habituate, yes. Yeah.
I would be really curious to know if you came across any research about the awareness of these so-called whales, the awareness to the tactics that are being employed to continue to get them to spend money with the game. Is there any difference? Do they engage less if they are fully aware they're mining my Facebook data and they're catering this to me? Does that make an impact?
That's a great question. I think that some of the slimier practices, like friending someone on Facebook and mining their personal information, probably would negatively impact how they feel about that. But just in terms of spending a lot of money and maybe being considered a whale for that game, not necessarily. There are many different motivations for doing that kind of spending. Like I mentioned, this is fulfilling some kind of need for someone to be engaging with a lot of time or money. In some cases, it's a matter of social standing. It's kind of conspicuous consumption, especially in countries like Saudi Arabia and China, where it's, well, I can afford to spend this much money on the game, and that kind of gives me a certain status in the game or with the people that I know. And I think that there would be less of an inclination there to think badly about it. But if it is something like a random reward where you think you have a good shot at it and you just keep spending money after money and not getting it, something like that would lead to more of a negative reaction. But I think that, again, that's a personal thing that depends on what is it that you're trying to get out of it. Because if what you're trying to get out of it is that you're spending a lot of money and showing people what you can afford to do it, then it's going to take a lot to make you feel like you're being taken advantage of, maybe. Oh, yes, you, and then I heard someone over there.
As people learn about the manipulativeness of games, does that allow them to reduce their engagement in the games?
Yeah, this is an ongoing question in the industry that they're struggling with right now. And there's kind of two schools of thought on that from what I've seen. One is that as this becomes a little more transparent, that people are going to choose to opt out and stop spending money. The numbers so far do not bear that out. People are spending more and more money on games that do this kind of thing. And that's the other school, is saying, even though all this is going on and some of it is super effective at gaining money, we're still getting better at influencing behavior in new ways and learning more and more devious ways of getting people to do what we want them to. We haven't reached the pinnacle yet of influencing behavior, and so it's likely that it's only going to get worse. So I'm not sure which way it'll go. I think what does happen, though, is that there is a personal development with an individual game where people reach a point and they say, I don't like anymore what this game is doing. What I think a lot of times ends up happening, though, is they just go to a different game. And because it usually is not obvious at first what's happening, it's really only after you've played for a period of time that some of these mechanics are kind of laid bare and you see them for what they are, which is just purely something that's designed to keep you going and not really providing any additional entertainment.
What was the first school of
That will wise up and get better at it. But some things never change. And the other, the interesting thing, you'll hear this from psychologists too, is that just knowing that these things exist and that people do things to influence your behavior doesn't actually make you that much better at resisting them. It might make you a little quicker to notice them, but these things are happening at a subconscious level, and we can only evolve so fast. And that is the problem. Like, Molly mentioned again too, technology is changing just so fast, our brains can't keep up with it. And that's part of the problem with technology addiction in general right now. We weren't made to handle this much input all the time. Was there a question from up here?
I have the same question.
Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
You seem to be well versed in the gaming world. I'm removed from it, and there seems to be a lot of emerging technologies. And I just kind of want to get your take on what you see the future of gaming as and how ethics play into it. Because it looks really pervasive to me from my standpoint. I'm like, holy crap, this is going to be.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I didn't even get into gamification, right? Which is kind of the spreading of these kinds of mechanics into everything that we do where people want to influence our behavior. So it's not just games per se, but other things like social media apps that are using these same mechanics to drive behavior. And for games themselves, the next frontier might be something like virtual reality or AR, augmented reality, where again, these are new frontiers, and we've just begun to explore the impact of those on our consciousness and psychology, and who knows where they could go. I am an optimist. I love playing games, and you can see as technology advances that people are able to do cool things and make really fun experiences. So, I don't want to give a negative cast to this whole thing, but yeah, I guess only time will tell. Any other questions? I think we have time for at least one more. Yes.
How do you get habit forming without it turning into addiction?
Yeah, well, that is the design intent question, because I don't know if you can prevent against addiction, since the habits and addiction are so closely related. And addiction is such a personal thing. I really don't know. I think that's an excellent question. Are there some kind of fail-safes that can be built into a design to prevent something from tipping over into an addictive behavior? And the problem is that it can be really hard to tell. So I hope so. Again, but I don't have an answer for that. I think it's a great thing to keep in mind, though, especially if you're concerned that something that you're designing has the potential to, or has been shown to, be addiction forming. But as I mentioned before too, anything can become addictive. It just has to fulfill that personal psychological need in order to do so. And one thing too to mention is that these exact same mechanics that are driving this habitual behavior are pretty much the exact same mechanics that are just used for engagement and fun in a lot of games. And so sometimes the answer to that really comes down to who is benefiting from this habitual behavior. If it's a pay-to-play game that I'm just really engaged in and I'm having fun coming back to and playing, that's fine. But if it's causing me to go into an app and spend money that I don't necessarily have to spend, then it's sort of a different equation. So I think it also bears thinking about what is the result of this behavior.
Maybe we can flip that into thinking, what is the intent of this?
Yeah, I think you need to think about both for sure. Yeah. What are we intending? What's the design intent? And then what is the actual result?
Yeah, because from a business perspective, like they're always going to want to make money.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they're going to want to push for habitual or addictive stuff. Make that money.
Right. Yeah, and I think in games, I hope and I believe that there is a conversation happening, because free-to-play has become so dominant. Is there a way that we can make this model work without it becoming addictive or harmful? And there are definitely companies out there that are making these types of games, but they're different models from the social stuff that I talked about. You know, I presented those alternatives, and there are companies out there saying, hey, we did this and it's great. The truth is, though, those games don't make it to the top 10. The flip side of that is they don't have to, because if you are a huge game publisher and you've invested all this money, well, then it has to be a hit and make billions of dollars to be successful. If you're a small game company, independent company, and you have just 1 or 2 people working on it and you make a couple $1 million, then that's a hit for you. So there's scale is sort of a question there too. All right, thank you.